Okay, it's the early hours of the morning here in the UK, and just want to kind of update this situation in New Zealand. There's a lot of talking points around this, so bear with me. So the main suspect, Brenton Tarrant, has appeared in court. The footage had his face blanked out. I assume there's a reason for that. But he didn't speak. He didn't say anything. He's 28 years old, an Australian national, and it's known that he's had this 87-page manifesto online, which appears to be a rambling diatribe with all sorts of far right ideology therein. Um, Among other things, it has references to ancient battles like the Battle of Tours in Europe. It has references to Valhalla. It has references to the Serb nationalist Radovan Karadzic, um, and many other things, the American gun law debate, the white genocide conspiracy, all sorts of things. And I'm not even going to go through them all because yeah. Um, so there's a lot of talking points to be made from this. There's been a response from around the world, of course. Theresa May said that just as New Zealand has stood by us, we will stand by New Zealand. Um, One aspect of this is that the attack occurred in two different places. Christchurch is quite a big city, I understand, a metropolitan population of 600,000. So some people might wonder how could one guy commit both attacks? Well, Anders Breivik in Norway committed the atrocity in Oslo, then went on to commit the even bigger atrocity on Utoya Island. So it is possible this guy apparently had a vehicle. So that's an interesting aspect. I mean, that shows how this sort of thing can unfold. One aspect that's also now coming up is New Zealand's gun laws. Apparently, they're a lot weaker than Australia, and that may be why he didn't choose Sydney or Melbourne to carry out this atrocity, but New Zealand. And I must be honest, I wasn't aware of that. But immediately, there's been a different response from the New Zealand authorities than there is often in the United States in mass shootings there. Immediately, there's going to be a review into New Zealand's gun regulation. It is known that in Australia, the last mass shooting there back in 1996, Australia introduced stringent gun laws and there hasn't been an equivalent massacre since. So they have been effective. Um, I mean, it is also true that New Zealand doesn't have a history of gun violence, but um, this is really something that's blown a hole in New Zealand. I mean, it's not the only example of terrorism. There has been other incidents. Back in 1985, there was the attack on the Greenpeace ship. That was actually state terrorism from none other than the Republic of France. And it led to a serious rift between New Zealand and France over that incident. One person died, and there was material damage. So that was an example of state terrorism. Terrorism as a concept is very important to define because sometimes we do see mass shootings in the States and people say, oh, why is this not being called terrorism? Well, that's because in a lot of those mass shootings, it's not politically driven in the sense that often it's someone who has had a grudge with their family, with a boss. So it tends to be workplace situations. That's not to minimize it. Any time people are gunned down in cold blood, it's heinous and evil, just as much as a terrorist incident. But there is clear examples of politically motivated violence. It should be called terrorism. For example, I would describe the Dylan Roof incident in Charleston back in 2015 as an act of far right terrorism, white supremacist terrorism, because he specifically targeted the black community. 9 people killed. Um, there's been responses from around the world, like I say, and two world leaders in particular highlight the sort of different camps that are responding to this, and both are wrong. So Donald Trump was asked specifically, is there need for concern about the rise of white supremacy around the world? Trump shamefully came out with, no, I don't think there is. He minimized it. And of course, he sent condolences to the victims, but that was that was disgraceful. Recep Tayyip Erdogan is the other extreme of trying to politicize the Muslim victimhood narrative. Erdogan once again showed what an odious demagogue he is um, by saying that there's a Western conspiracy against Muslims. And he demanded Western countries do more to stop this. Well, we do have to recognize the problem, but it's a bit rich for a demagogue like Erdogan to be talking about doing more on extremism when this is a man who has fostered Islamist extremism and who, no doubt, if he had his way, would bring in blasphemy laws to Turkey. Erdogan, in my view, is one of the vilest world leaders there is. But those two attitudes, I want to just analyze them a little bit more because they are the two. But before I go into that, it's right that the attacker is scrutinized, his ideology is scrutinized, because there are other Brenton Tarrants out there. I mean, this guy is a second Anders Breivik. And whilst there's understandably been a focus on Islamist attacks around the world, I mean, in recent years, let's look at the Islamist attacks on non-Muslim countries: Paris, Nice, Brussels, Berlin, London, Manchester, Orlando, Barcelona. So there has been a steady chain. Sydney was another one of violent attacks, Islamist attacks on non-Muslim countries in non-Muslim countries, and countless Islamist attacks within Islamic countries, particularly aimed at minorities, such as the attacks on Christians in Egypt. Many violent, bloody attacks. What has Erdogan got to say about that? Um, so that's very palpable. It's very obvious, and it there has to be there has to be an awareness of that. There has to be honesty about that. But these events in New Zealand are not unique. There was, of course, a Norway attack. 2 years ago, there was the attack on the mosque in Quebec City, 6 people killed. And there's been individual incidents. An elderly man was murdered in Birmingham by a neo-Nazi Ukrainian of Ukrainian descent here in the UK. That occurred at the same time as the Lee Rigby murder the same year, but got far less attention. Now, it's legitimate to ask why. Um, the attack on Joe Cox was definitely far right in nature because the attacker specifically took issue with her because he saw her as being for open door immigration, for her work with refugees. That was specifically politically motivated, and he shouted, "This is for Britain first," or something to that effect. Um, so, what's troubling is this could end up in some sort of sick competition between Islamist attacks and far right attacks. What the New Zealand attack shows is that far right terrorism isn't just a concept. In the UK, we also have a history going further back, way back to the Soho nail bombing in 1999. 3 people killed, dozens wounded. So far right terrorism is not just a concept, it is a very real, palpable thing. And it's just as sick, just as heinous, just as evil as Islamist attacks. So there's two groups of people I think this bears relevance to. Firstly, there are right wingers who want to downplay this. I have seen it online. I have seen people who really do believe that all Muslims are the problem. And there are people right now who will be thinking, oh, well, who cares? We've had these attacks, Islamist attacks against the West, so, why all this attention on Christchurch? Well, there should be. There should be. And they're guilty of minimizing far right extremism. They're guilty of trying to deflect from that and not talk about it. So let me put this on record. I'm a white man. I recognize a white man was responsible for this carnage. And I, as a white man, am saying very clearly we need to recognize and confront white supremacist extremism. It's real, it's palpable, and it's a threat. So, there is that camp, those who want to downplay it. Now, there is another camp, and that is Islamists. What they will do is they will try to capitalize on this by saying, oh, look, there's a conspiracy against Muslims. Western countries are against Muslims. Erdogan's comments are utterly shameful because what he's trying to do is play up the Muslim victimhood narrative. Now, the fact of the matter is, as horrible as this incident was, Western countries remain far more tolerant to Muslim minorities than Islamic countries do to their minorities. That's a fact. And that also goes out to Imran Khan, who said that terrorism has no religion. Terrorism has no religion insofar as there's different forms of terrorism. But when Muslims who have a knee jerk reaction every time there's an Islamist attack, like, oh, well, it's terrible, we condemn it, but it's got nothing to do with Islam. No, that mentality needs to be confronted because unless you name an ideology, unless you're honest about the ideology, then it cannot be confronted. It's so good just making an abstract, oh, we condemn terrorism. And it isn't just Islamists who do that. And frankly, Muslims who don't want to be honest about the problem in the midst. It's also the regressive left. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn laid a reef at the New Zealand embassy, and I don't fault that. That's the appropriate thing to do. It's a mark of respect for the victims. And he said, this is to show that, I think his reef said something to the effect of, this is to show that the diversity must be cherished. Now, I wouldn't take issue with those sentiments, but I would like to see more consistency from Jeremy Corbyn because when there is Islamist attacks, sure, he condemns it, but he will not name Islamist ideology. Yet, look at what's going to happen. Jeremy Corbyn's going to be very honest and very vocal about far right hatred. And that's right, he should be. But the regressive left, I would like to see more consistency from them. And I would also like to see more consistency from the regressive right. Both sides are guilty of minimizing extremes. I've seen people who I regard as reasonable people otherwise who are, saying that religion's a problem. Let's just ban religion. That isn't going to work. It may well be true that most of the world's conflicts today are caused by religion. But you can't just ban religion. That's stupid. Freedom of conscience, religious freedom, is a human right. And let's not forget that has been tried in communist totalitarian states. The Chinese are trying it right now in Xinjiang. Collective punishment of all Muslims is not the answer. It's really not the answer. But what we do need to do is be honest about ideology and be honest about the fact that that is a root cause of terrorism. It's so good just saying, oh, it's horrible, we condemn it. There has to be candid, honest discussion and debate about the nature of these attacks. So there will be Islamists out there who will use this, try and capitalize on it as a way to try and shut down criticism of Islamic extremism. Well, that isn't going to work and it shouldn't be allowed to work. What happened in New Zealand opens up the reality, it reminds us that there is a problem with that sort of white nationalist mantra, but it does not mitigate the threat from Islamist extremism. It doesn't. And there will be some Islamists out there who try to insist that, who try to say that there is, because of what's happened, then let's not talk about Islamic extremism. It should not be a case that one extremism promotes a situation where you cannot talk about another. That would be utterly absurd. Now, New Zealand has had, it's a small country, but Christchurch in particular has dealt with mass trauma, albeit of different kinds in recent years. Back in 2011, the Christchurch earthquake was devastating. So the authorities there will not be totally immune from dealing with mass trauma. Nevertheless, this was man-made, and I think that aspect's particularly shocking. But you know, it just shows this can happen anywhere. It could be Iceland tomorrow. So I think the authorities took the right approach by putting mosques on lockdown, and I also think it's the right approach. If apparently this guy Brenton Tarrant had his firearms, he had firearms legally purchased, so it's right to look into that. Um, Understandably, the discussion in New Zealand is going to be about anti-Muslim bigotry, and but let's not overlook the fact this was an Australian national, it wasn't a New Zealand national. So maybe it's Australia that also needs to look into that and think, well, what do we need to do to confront? I hope the Australian government, I'm sure they are, will be looking into what can we do about white supremacist extremism here, because Australia could very well be targeted by that, although they do have more stringent gun laws. And it's just a depressing situation when one extremism is fueling another. Um, New Zealand, my impression is it's a pretty safe country. In fact, the last time there was violence on this scale in New Zealand, you have to go way back to World War II when there was a violent riot in a prisoner of war camp. That's the last time there was this level of violence in New Zealand. I still have a very good impression from New Zealand. I think it's a great country, and I do consider it one of the most progressive and tolerant countries in the world. So, if the agenda of this white nationalist was to try and stoke up some sort of race war, he's going to fail. And those apologists for white supremacy and white far right extremism, those who insist, oh, it's not really a problem, this is your answer. It is. Trump's comments were disgraceful because if we saw the same sort of attack from an Islamist, he would be, you know, he would take a very different approach to that. There has to be consistency here. And that has to come in being honest about the nature of this ideology. So when an attack that is blatantly far right in nature occurs, the right approach is to discuss far right ideology and how it can be challenged and confronted and decreased. When Islamist attacks occur, the right approach is to discuss Islamist extremism. And it is no good saying, as Imran Khan and Recep Tayyip Erdogan tried to insist, oh, it's got nothing to do with Islam. Wrong. Islamic extremism has a lot to do with Islam, actually. What happened in New Zealand doesn't mitigate that. Um, I'll close with a final thought. I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier in the video because I've had to upload this a few times. Obviously, there's going to be focus on the killer, but let's not overlook victims. Naid Rashid, very brave man who confronted the killer and who died in the attack. I hope his family gets some sort of posthumous award. So very often in these attacks we focus on the terrorists and overlook the victims. So that's not, you know, let's focus on the victims as well. 49 people. Apparently they were mostly men in their 30s and 40s. They all had individual lives, hopes, aspirations. Um, so there should be focus just as much on them as on the killer. Anyway, I'll round this up. I'll just say this: there are toxic forces out there. it may well be that far right groups are using the same sort of grooming tactics online as the Islamist groups use, and the authorities can't take their eye off the ball. And I'm not saying they are, but they really have the work cut out for them, because these poisonous forces, reasonable people really need to be aware of what they're trying to do. And all reasonable people have to be. So it comes down to white people to be honest about the threat from white supremacists. And for what it's worth, I think most white people do acknowledge that. Non Muslims have been among the first to condemn this. And that's very important. So when Islamist attacks occur, I want to hear less of from the likes of Cage and other um, basically apologists for Islamist extremism, or let's say the polite face of Islamism. It's all very well condemning Islamist attacks, but if you're going to turn around and say, oh, well, this has nothing to do with Islam, let's not talk about it, or any discussion about it is Islamophobia, that's very dangerous. That's what Erdogan's trying to say. So this attack should not be used by anyone to try and silence debate and discussion of Islamist extremism. What it should do is remind us that there is far right extremism. My thoughts go out to all the victims. I mean, we always think of those who have died, but 48 people are wounded. I mean, it must be, I imagine a gunshot would be incredibly excruciating pain. Um, like I say, the New Zealand authorities have had experience of mass trauma with the 2011 earthquake, but still, shocking, shocking incident. And authorities around the world will need to be really on the guard, particularly in secular democracies. So really need to be on the guard for potential other far right attacks, maybe copycat attacks. Because very often these people, I mean, this guy quoted Anders Breivik. It's good in a sense that he's alive, because that means information could be extracted about maybe if he's got other connections. I understand several other people were arrested, although he carried out the attack alone. So it's going to be interesting to see what comes out from the trial. I hope he's put away forever. I mean, New Zealand shouldn't go soft on this guy. He's a dangerous terrorist. He's committed the worst act of mass murder in modern New Zealand history. And, I think this, I don't know if New Zealand has whole life tariffs. This is certainly a case where that should be the case. And if Australia extradites him, then they should throw him away for life.